And I was looking for jobs in a variety of, I would say, more progressive issues, and the ACLU job showed up as an administrative assistant, and I simply applied, and it was a great match. I'd done lots of political work while I was in college, but it was my first full job out of college, starting at ACLU in a pretty entry-level position, and things evolved from there. 1982 is when I graduated from college, so I was doing a lot around Central America issues at the time, particularly around what was going on in El Salvador, but also nuclear freeze, that kind of work. And so the organizations I was looking at tended to be either involved with nuclear weapons or with Central America liberation issues. Although interestingly, at the time, we were involved in a project around immigration with El Salvador, and we, in the DC ACLU at the time, we had a project where we published some reports about the condition of people from El Salvador, what was going on with them. So I did end up getting involved in those issues, even at ACLU. Although, not surprisingly, in the DC ACLU, many of the issues we worked on were around First Amendment issues at the time, around the right to protest, major set of lawsuits involved with protesting in Lafayette Square across from the White House. This was during the Reagan administration. And so many of the issues we were involved with, and I ended up spending a lot of time in DC City Council lobbying a variety of issues, but it was heavily free expression issues, as well as death penalty was a major piece of work that I was involved with at the time, a coalition. And at the time, the DC ACLU also served Montgomery County and Prince George's County in Maryland. So we had all three jurisdictions. And I spent a lot of time working in Montgomery and Prince George's as well. So the issues during the Reagan administration was a very different time. So at the congressional level, I say First Amendment issues. It was also, we worked on reestablishing the Voting Rights Act, which was expiring and had to be reauthorized by Congress. And because even I was in the local office, we were working in the congressional issues around the Voting Rights Act and in voting rights issues more broadly. Free expression issues, this was a time where Ed Meese was the Attorney General and James Watt was Secretary of the Interior, and their approach to a number of these issues was far more restrictive than we at ACLU thought ought to be. I mean, it was a very interesting time around these issues, around free expression on the mall, around the Capitol building, in Lafayette Square. Literally, one of the interesting issues on Lafayette Square was, I remember I did the newsletter at the time, is sleeping speech, because there were homeless people protesting and they slept there and protested during the day. And some folks will have heard of Mitch Snyder and the Community for Creative Nonviolence, which is a major homeless organization. And they were our client in that case. And that was it was just a great time. And of course, when you're young, it's different too. But we had the entire team, and people you may have heard of, Barry Lynn, who later went on to lead Americans for Separation of Church and State, and John Shattuck, who became Deputy Secretary of State under the Clinton administration, and Vice President at Harvard, and various people who went on to lots of other wonderful things in their careers. We also had an interesting incident at the time when abortion rights were a big issue, not surprisingly, and at that time our office was bombed. And this was 84 or so, somewhere. I've got the newsletter put together on it. And it was on a Saturday morning, and we were in a building on 6th and Pennsylvania Southeast, people who know that. And a fellow who was bombing Planned Parenthood offices and other places that provided abortions came and put a bomb at the door of the ACLU. It was a Saturday morning. One person was actually in the office, in the back of the office, and I lived 2 blocks from the office, and I had been in very late the night before. And when I came in, the building was taped off and I saw something hanging out of the window in our office. And I said, oh my God, I forgot to turn off the coffee machine. There must have been a fire. And I went in, I said, what's going on? And the cops said, oh, somebody blew it up. And then I realized, okay, it wasn't the coffee machine, but it was indeed our office. And not a lot of damage, although I still have somewhere an old ACLU poster, and the pipe bomb blew a hole through the First Amendment in that poster from the ACLU at the time, because my office was right by the door. So that was, there was certainly some drama. It was a tense time around those issues. The fellow got prison time. They caught him and he got prison time for that. So a variety of issues we were working on. And I don't think in DC or ultimately Baltimore where I worked, we had nearly the challenges folks did in other places. My colleagues at the time in places like Mississippi and a good friend of mine ran the Utah community, Utah ACLU, much more complicated. In fact, there was a woman, and I can't remember now, I think she was in Oklahoma, and I think this was prior to her being the ACLU director, but I can't remember for sure, but her house was burned down because she opposed prayer in schools. And I think she ended up becoming the ACLU director after the fact, but it was a much more complicated thing. It was pretty tough. Schneider, who was a very well-known homeless rights advocate in, well, nationally, but he ran something called the Community for Creative Nonviolence. And I had come to know of him while I was in school and was impressed with the way he brought attention to homeless issues. And really kind of, you call him the father of the homeless movement in DC and a more radical perspective. But he passed some years ago from suicide, which was unfortunate. But I mean, in that world, an incredibly impressive, interesting, complicated guy, played by Martin Sheen in a movie about his life some years ago. I started as newspaper assistant and became the assistant director. And I had a curious thing that both of the executive directors I worked for ended up being ill and had extended illnesses. So I had the opportunity to do a lot more leadership work at the time and become the spokesperson and whatnot, even as a kid, basically. And then when, in 1986, I took on the director job at the ACLU of Maryland. So I was executive director there for 10 years. It was an era where ACLU was moving in to a kind of collectively to some of the what you think of now as ACLU. In the 60s, 70s, 80s, now ACLU was involved with death penalty and anti-war, anti-Vietnam War, and involved with housing discrimination and lots of different things. But there was a heavy dose of primarily First Amendment. And when I went to the Maryland ACLU, we had two cases. I can't remember what one of them was, but the other was a Baltimore City cop who was performing Al Jolson blackface routines and was being disciplined for that. And that was one of our cases. The first call I got when I arrived at the Maryland ACLU, I pick up the phone and the guy says, hi, I need your help. My name is Roger Kelly. I'm the Grand Dragon of the Invisible Knights of the Empire of the Ku Klux Klan of Frederick County. And I said, oh my God, what have I gotten myself into? We ended up representing him because it was basically just a demonstration to merge. But there was a heavy dose of that. In that time, in that 10 years, I'm really proud, and partly it's the woman who became the legal director and then became the executive director after I left. But we filed lawsuits against 3 jails on Eastern Shore of Maryland. We filed the first in the country driving while black lawsuit. We filed a lawsuit in support of gay marriage. We filed housing discrimination suit challenging the entirety of public housing in Baltimore City. So we really started to shift toward racial, continuing to do the basic First Amendment stuff, but we were, and continuing to do death penalty, continuing to do abortion rights work, but starting to do some of the, what I would call perhaps the second generation of ACLU work. I think we're now in what I would call the third generation. And I have on my wall a cover of the Baltimore Sun magazine that says ACLU, a changing role for the underdog's watchdog. And that's from, I believe, 1986, the year I got there. And so, it was the shift. And ultimately, of course, it has been shifting even more since then. And so it's the evolution of our understanding of individual rights and individual liberties. And just as an example, I've said this story before, Baltimore City passed an anti-discrimination LGBT, or was it LGBT at the time? I'm not even sure if it was still just lesbian and gay. I'm not sure anymore. But it passed an anti-discrimination in Baltimore City. And I remember sitting in a room with a group of folks after that passed and saying, okay, what next? And it was gay and lesbian activists in Baltimore City and me as a representative. But one of the issues that came up at the time was gay marriage. And I was talking to the fellow sitting next to me, and I said, Steve, what is this? And he said, this guy always wants to talk about gay marriage. Nobody cares about that. That's not going anywhere. And interestingly, of course, at that, then the AIDS movement started to happen and started to become a big issue. And ultimately, we got to the gay marriage thing, which in the mid 80s was dismissed by most of the people in that room. And so it's interesting how movements change and what makes a movement work changes over time. Yeah, I think that the overall work ACLU does around immigrants, around people who are different than the perceived majority culture, and the work to defend folks who seem from a different space, wrong, dangerous. I think that willingness to be in that space, to stand up in the face of significant criticism, I think especially as the country evolves over the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years and becomes a majority minority country, those issues will have been proven right. And I think a lot of people already believe that. One of the interesting things now is because of the ability to communicate with a broad group of people all the time, we can all find our communities that agree with us. It was far harder to do before the technology change. That finding your community, you lived in a neighborhood and you talked to the people in the neighborhood and you made phone calls and you saw people here and there, but you didn't have nearly the connections and nearly the ability to get support from folks. So I think the kind of law, I used to talk about the pursuit of loneliness, right? And there's a great book, I think it's Michael Slater, about the pursuit of loneliness, which was about being in a movement, and it's a very lonely place sometimes. And it's not as lonely anymore. And so I think that the people deeply involved have folks who are going to support them along the way. After 15 years at ACLU, I said, okay, it's time to do something different. Went to grad school for a year in Boston and thought I would go back to DC or Baltimore, and kind of got hijacked for a job in New Hampshire at the Community Foundation up there. And they were looking for somebody who could help them move more into policy. And so I did the vice president for programs there for a few years. And then after 7 or 8 years doing that, took a job with a group called the National Voting Rights Institute, which was doing campaign finance work, and then re-merged with a group called Demos, where I ran the democracy programs for a few years, which was about same-day voter registration, National Voter Registration Act, things like that. And a lot of folks will know Demos, which continues to do great work. And then got the call to go to the Vermont Community Foundation and be the president there. And I did that for a while, and then got approached about this job here in Delaware. So my career has kind of been split between Northern New England and the Mid-Atlantic, and split between civil liberties, civil rights, voting rights, and community foundations. And I see all of that. Community foundations are about bringing voice and bringing support to a broad group of people, as are civil liberties, civil rights, voting rights issues. They're all about making the American dream real for people in different ways. So that's how. And as far as Wilmington and Delaware, interesting place, and I think one of the wonderful things about this place is how representative it is of America in its diversity. As much as we love living in northern New England, New Hampshire and Vermont are not terribly representative of America. And the appeal here in part is a state that is rural, urban, and suburban, liberal, conservative, and moderate, and racially diverse in a way that not so much the Latinos get, although that's changing, but certainly the African American community certainly mirrors America. And that made it a place that's more interesting, because I think our work needs to be about how do we create this diverse, pluralistic community in a time where people only want to be around people like themselves. So what we do is we work with people who are generous, who want to find ways to deploy their money through grant programs, and we lean in on particular issues where we think some philanthropic emphasis can make a particular difference. We collectively are made up of 1,100 different funds established by companies, nonprofits, government agencies, in some cases individuals, families, all supporting some good in Delaware. And that may mean a scholarship program, that may mean support for after-school programs, that may mean support for arts programs. And so we are trying to knit a whole that is all about a better quality of life for everybody and reducing the opportunity gap. And so what that means is when we distribute in a typical year anywhere from $15 to $20 million to organizations and scholarships. Last year, because of the pandemic and extra money that came in, we did over $30 million. But we will grant those programs out to all of these different pools. And then we're also responsive when companies or collective actions come in to try to aggregate resources and bring a broader group of people together. So, for instance, around COVID, we brought in $5 million that we granted out to nonprofit organizations to help them survive. We helped the state distribute $25 million in CARES Act money to nonprofits. So that's just one example. And the work itself is, yes, grant making, but it's also importantly having diverse groups of people engaged in that work. Additionally, we look at racial equity issues and created our own cohort to make recommendations in how we should do our work. We created a program to do grants that we're doing now, grants for people of color-led organizations to provide capacity building, because typically those, and in particular the small organizations, it's hard. Look, I was 26 when I started running a small statewide organization. You don't know what the heck you're doing. And so you need people around you who can hold your hand when you don't know what the heck you're doing, because all of us are in that place. I could fake it, and partly because of the networks of support I had. But for some people, if you come from a place where you've never seen anybody do that kind of thing before, and you're just trying to figure it out, you need more support. And that's one of the big challenges for any new organization and new director, and in particular, people from communities where that's not been part of their work. I mean, I grew up, my parents were teachers, so I didn't know this work, but I found myself in places where I saw some people do it and thought, okay, I can do that thing too. So I had some opportunity for some mentoring before I was thrown into the fire. So I didn't always love the things I had to go into the legislature and lobby on. I didn't always love the issues that I was working on. But I think that the overall, what ACLU does is so critical. And I think that having the ACLU willing to do hard things is so important. And I think one of the challenges going forward for ACLU, and it's no different than it's ever been for ACLU, is when things come up that are going to make people mad, make your allies mad. I'm reminded of a friend who used to be a speaker in a house in Vermont. And she said, you know, it was easy to say no to people with whom I disagreed. What was always hard is when I had to say no to somebody I generally agreed with. And I think that's just an ongoing challenge for an organization of principals, that sometimes you're going to be in a place where you have to say to your friends, not this time. And I think as ACLU's profile is bigger than ever and ACLU's resources are bigger than ever, that diligence to hard things is going to remain. And that's why ACLU is so important, because ACLU has always done that, and I expect always will.